He was a veteran who wanted silence. But when his brother's war dog followed a black horse into the snow, they found something no one was meant to see. Watch what happened that night. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. The first light of winter crept slowly over the plains, staining the sky a faint gray that promised no warmth. The world outside Jonathan Reed's ranch was a sea of white and quiet, broken only by the long moan of the wind across the frozen fields. Snow clung to every fence post and drifted high against the side of the barn, swallowing the lower boards in soft, uneven mounds. Inside the small wooden house, the stove crackled weakly, its heat barely enough to drive away the sharp morning chill that crept through every crack in the old frame. Jonathan stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching against the thin crust of ice. His breath hung in the air in slow clouds. He wore the same flannel shirt and work coat he'd worn for years, a wool scarf wrapped twice around his neck. In his hand, a dented tin mug of coffee steamed like a small signal fire in the pale light. At his feet sat Rex, the old German shepherd, whose gray muzzle betrayed the years as much as Jonathan's lined face did. The dog's ears twitched at distant sounds, the wind shifting through the cottonwoods, the faint creak of snow under the weight of settling ice. But his gaze never left the horizon. For a long moment, neither man nor dog moved. They stood as they did every morning, facing east, watching the day rise from behind the ridge. The world seemed still, untouched, and yet Jonathan always felt the same quiet unease in that stillness. It was the kind of silence that didn't bring peace, but memory, an echo of other mornings, half a world away, when quiet only meant that the enemy hadn't yet shown themselves. He took a slow sip of coffee and glanced down at the shepherd. "Still standing guard, huh?" he muttered, his voice rough from sleep and years of disuse. Rex's tail thumped once against the porch boards. Inside, the walls were lined with reminders of another life. A single photograph hung near the door, two brothers in uniform, standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a sandbag wall. Between them, younger than and bright-eyed, was Rex, his ears tall, his coat dark and full. On the back of the picture, written in a steady hand, were the words, "Together till the end." Jonathan never looked at it for long. 7 winters had passed since the day his brother was killed, since Rex had returned home on a transport plane without him. The army vet who delivered the dog had said only, "He made it out when the others didn't." Jonathan never asked for details. Some things a man didn't need spelled out. Rex had grown slower with the years, a stiffness in his joints that matched Jonathan's own, but his instincts remained sharp. He slept by the door, rose before dawn, and still responded to every gesture and whistle with the precision of a trained soldier. Jonathan talked to him more than he did to any person. It wasn't conversation so much as shared understanding, a language built on silence and loyalty. When the nights grew long and the wind howled through the rafters, Rex would rest his head on Jonathan's boot, and for a little while, the loneliness of the plains felt less like punishment and more like penance. The routine of their days rarely changed. Jonathan repaired fences, checked the cattle that grazed on what little grass broke through the snow, and split firewood until his shoulders ached. He avoided town except when supplies ran low. People respected him in the quiet, distant way they reserved for men they didn't quite know how to talk to. They called him the war man behind his back, and he didn't mind. The quiet suited him, or at least it had. Until that morning when something shifted in the frozen air. Rex's head snapped up first. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, not the bark of warning, but of recognition. Something unfamiliar and yet alive. Jonathan followed his gaze across the field toward the tree line. The wind carried a strange rhythm, a steady crunch of hooves against ice. out from the swirling curtain of snow emerged a figure so black it seemed to drink the light around it. A horse, tall and lean, its coat dark as midnight, its mane stiff with frost. Jonathan squinted. At first, he thought it was one of his neighbor's mares gone loose, but then he saw the scars. Around the neck, the hide was rubbed raw, pink welts cutting through the darkness of the skin where rope had bitten deep. The animal's breath steamed in the air, heavy and ragged, each exhale a ghostly plume. Rex stiffened beside him, every muscle tight. The horse didn't bolt as wild mustangs usually did. Instead, it stood there at the edge of the field, head high, eyes locked on the man and his dog. Jonathan felt an odd pull in his chest, a sense that the animal wasn't lost, but looking for something. He took a cautious step forward, but the horse snorted sharply, the sound loud in the brittle air, and turned away. Snow scattered in a spray as it galloped toward the ridge, its dark form swallowed by the white. For a long while after it vanished, Jonathan remained where he stood, the coffee in his hand gone cold. He told himself it was nothing, a stray that had escaped some rancher, frightened and half wild. Yet something about those eyes lingered in his mind as he went about his work. They weren't the eyes of a beast that feared men. They were the eyes of something that had seen men and learned to hate them. That night, as wind clawed at the windows, Jonathan lay awake, listening to the house creak. Rex slept at the foot of the bed, but would occasionally lift his head, growling softly toward the door. Each time, Jonathan reached down and rested a hand on the dog's back until the tension eased. Sleep came in broken fragments, filled with the same old dreams, gunfire in the distance, the smell of dust and smoke, his brother's voice shouting over the roar of chaos. He woke before dawn, heart racing, the echo of that voice fading into the cold stillness of the room. By morning, the storm had cleared, leaving the world hard and bright under a crust of ice. As he shoveled a path to the barn, the memory of the horse gnawed at him. He had seen plenty of wild animals wander across his land, before elk, coyotes, even a mountain lion once, but none had carried that strange air of purpose. Rex seemed to feel it too. He paced restlessly, nose to the wind, as if searching for a scent he couldn't quite place. 3 days passed without sign of the stallion. The routine of chores resumed, though Jonathan caught himself glancing more often toward the ridge. On the 4th night, when the moon rose white and full over the plains, Rex woke him with a sharp bark. Jonathan sat up, listening. The sound of hooves drifted faintly through the cold, measured, deliberate. He stepped onto the porch with his rifle slung loosely in his hand. There, at the far edge of the field, the black mustang stood once more. Its breath rolled like smoke in the moonlight. Frost clung to its mane like shards of glass. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Then the horse turned its head toward the north, pawed at the ground, and walked away through the drifts. Jonathan watched until it disappeared into the darkness. He felt the old stirring in his blood, the one he'd spent years trying to bury the instinct to follow, to uncover, to understand what waited beyond the line of safety. Rex stood beside him, silent, his eyes following the same path. The wind shifted, cold and sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke. Something human lingered in that air, something wrong. When dawn came, the decision had already formed. Jonathan packed supplies into his saddlebag, jerky, cartridges, matches, bandages. He cleaned the rifle with the same care he once gave to the weapons he carried overseas. Before leaving, he placed a gloved hand on Rex's head. "You're coming with me," he said quietly. The dog's tail moved once, slow and certain. They rode out beneath a pale sun that barely touched the snow. The trail of the Mustang was faint but visible, a series of deep impressions leading west toward the low hills. As they moved, the silence around them grew heavier, as if the world were holding its breath. Jonathan felt the weight of his brother's dog tags against his chest, cold beneath the layers of fabric. Each metallic tap against his skin echoed the heartbeat he tried to steady. He didn't know where the horse would lead them, but he knew one thing for certain: the stillness of his ranch, the fragile peace he had built, was over. Something out there in the frozen country had broken it, and he could no longer pretend the war was behind him. As the wind began to rise again, scattering snow in twisting spirals across the plain, the faint outline of hoofprints stretched before them into the white distance. Rex trotted close to the horse's flank, nose low, ears pricked. The world around them had turned to a canvas of ice and shadow, and somewhere beyond that horizon waited the truth the Mustang had come to show. Jonathan pulled his scarf tighter against his face and urged his horse forward. The cold bit deep into his bones, but for the first time in years, his purpose burned hot beneath the frozen sky. The wind had changed overnight. It carried the sharp bite of the northern ridges and the distant scent of pine and smoke, faint yet unmistakable. Jonathan Reed rode with his collar turned high, the coarse wool of his scarf stiffened by frost. Beside him, Rex padded through the snow in steady rhythm, leaving deep paw prints that matched the horse's slow, deliberate steps. The sun had barely cleared the horizon, and already the air burned with cold that seemed to reach straight into the bones. Yet for all the harshness of the morning, Jonathan felt more alive than he had in years. The silence around him was no longer the silence of isolation. It was a silence of purpose, thick with expectation. The trail left by the black Mustang was easy to follow at first. Each hoof had punched through the crust of snow, leaving a line of dark impressions that curved toward the hills. But as the land began to climb, the wind swept the surface clean, and soon the tracks became ghost-like, half buried beneath thin veils of drifting powder. Jonathan leaned low in the saddle, scanning the ground with the patience of a man who had once tracked enemies through dust and desert. Every broken branch, every faint shift of color in the snow told a story. Rex trotted ahead, pausing now and then to sniff the air. His breath came in quick white bursts, and the frost that gathered on his whiskers gave him the look of an old soldier gone gray in the field. By midday, the world around them had turned to shades of steel and white. The plains gave way to rolling ground, dotted with the black skeletons of trees long dead from drought and frost. Jonathan dismounted to give his horse a rest, and crouched beside a half-frozen creek. The water moved sluggishly beneath a skin of ice. He broke a piece of it with his glove and brought the cold water to his lips. Rex drank beside him, tongue rasping against the surface, before lapping greedily at the gap Jonathan had opened. When they had finished, the man studied the ground. Near the creek bed, clear against the mud, was a single hoof print. It was sharp-edged and deep, unshod and strong. He traced it lightly with his gloved fingers. The Mustang had passed here recently, no more than a few hours ago. But it wasn't the only track. Beside it, half sunk in the snow, were the faint outlines of boots. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. They were fresh, too fresh to be relics of an old camp or passing hunter. He rose slowly, the leather of his coat creaking in the cold. Rex lifted his head, nostrils flaring. The dog's ears tilted back, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Jonathan whispered a quiet command, and the sound died instantly. The air itself seemed to listen. He knew that feeling, the subtle weight of being watched, the prickling sense that something just beyond sight had already taken measure of him. It was a memory that belonged to another life, one filled with dust, gunfire, and unseen eyes behind the scope of a rifle. He had hoped never to feel it again. The trail led upward through a narrow pass where the trees thickened and the snow deepened to the knee. The light dimmed as clouds rolled in from the west, muting the world into shades of gray. Jonathan kept his horse close and his rifle ready, scanning the shadows between the trunks. Here and there, the marks of human presence grew clearer, ashes from an old fire pit, a strip of torn cloth frozen into the ice, and once, the hollow shell of a tin can half buried in snow. Whoever had been here had camped often, and not long ago. Rex stopped suddenly and began to bark once, short and sharp. Jonathan followed his gaze through the trees. At first he saw nothing, then realized the pattern of white and shadow ahead concealed a shape. A cabin, hunched low under the weight of snow, its roof bowed and blackened by time. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney, but the hole at its top was clean, the soot fresh. The air smelled faintly of burned pine and old tobacco. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. He tied the horse to a low branch and approached on foot, moving silently, his boots sinking deep into the powder. The cabin's door was half open, creaking faintly in the wind. He eased it wider with the barrel of his rifle. The smell hit him first. Stale air, wood smoke, and something else beneath it, something metallic and sour. Inside, the weak light that filtered through cracks in the walls fell on a single table scattered with the remains of a meal. A can of beans, a knife, a blackened tin cup. In one corner lay a rumpled bedroll, still pressed with the shape of a body. He crouched, pressing his fingers to the fabric. It was still faintly warm. Whoever had been here had left only hours before. Rex's nails clicked softly against the boards as he sniffed around the room, tail stiff, hackles raised. Near the hearth, the dog stopped and whined. Jonathan turned toward him, following the sound. Behind a wooden partition, a second door hung crooked on its hinges. The smell coming from beyond it was stronger now, rancid, thick with the unmistakable odor of decay. Jonathan braced himself, pushed the door open, and felt the air shift. The small lean-to behind the cabin was a slaughterhouse. The ground was littered with bones, stripped clean and frozen into the dirt. Hides hung stiff as boards from nails driven into the beams, their edges dark with old blood. The light caught the curve of skulls, horse skulls, stacked in a rough pile against the wall. Jonathan's breath fogged in front of him as he stared. Every muscle in his body went still. Rex pressed close to his leg, growling deep, a low, continuous sound that vibrated through the silence. He crouched beside one of the skulls, brushing away a film of frost. A small, clean hole pierced the bone between the eyes. Not hunting execution. He looked at the hides, at the crude tools scattered around the floor, and saw the truth plain as daylight. These men weren't trappers or ranchers trying to survive the winter. They were killers, running a trade in wild horses. The black Mustang's scars flashed across his mind, the rope burns, the fear, the fury in its eyes. It had escaped this place. It had seen what happened here, and it had led him straight to the ones responsible. Jonathan backed out slowly, closing the door behind him as if to trap the stench inside. He stood for a long moment in the cold air, staring at the cabin. His breath came hard and steady, the same way it had on battlefields long ago, just before the first shot. The difference now was that he was alone, save for the old dog at his side. The sun was sinking fast, the sky bruised purple at the edges. Snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting down in lazy spirals. Jonathan pulled his collar tighter and led Rex away from the clearing, circling until they reached a rise overlooking the cabin. From there, they could see the valley below, empty but for the faint ribbon of smoke curling from the chimney. Somewhere out in that fading light, the men who did this were coming back. He felt it in his gut. He built no fire, made no sound. The snow itself became his camouflage. Rex lay close, head on his paws, watching with eyes that glowed faintly in the dusk. Jonathan kept his rifle across his knees and his back to a pine tree, listening. Time stretched thin. The only movement came from the falling snow and the slow drift of night settling over the land. Then, at last, the quiet broke. The distant rhythm of hooves came first, dull thuds that echoed against the frozen ground. Then the jangle of metal, voices, rough, careless, confident. 3 shapes emerged through the trees, leading horses that snorted clouds of steam into the cold. The men dismounted by the cabin, their laughter low and ugly. Jonathan studied them through the veil of snow. The first was a broad-shouldered brute, with a beard and a pistol holstered at his side, clearly the leader. The second moved with the easy precision of a marksman, his rifle slung ready, his eyes scanning the darkness even as he walked. The third was little more than a boy, his steps hesitant, his thin coat no match for the cold. Jonathan watched as they carried their spoils in side bundles wrapped in canvas that clinked faintly with the sound of metal. He saw the leader kick open the door, heard their voices rise in crude jokes. Then the sound of the boy protesting softly, quickly silenced by a growled command. Inside, light flickered through the cracks in the walls, the glow of lanterns. Rex shifted beside him, ears pricked, muscles tensed. Jonathan laid a hand on the dog's back. The old soldier went still, but the tension hummed through him like a wire ready to snap. The wind picked up, carrying snatches of laughter from below. The leader's voice was loudest, boasting about the skins they'd haul out before spring. Another voice muttered something about a black stallion that had gotten away. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He stayed where he was, letting the snow cover them both. The cold numbed his fingers, but his mind was sharp, his thoughts measured. The night deepened around them, swallowing the last color from the world. Inside the cabin, the men drank and talked, their shadows moving against the frosted windows. Jonathan waited, patient as he had been in every ambush, knowing that timing was everything. He watched the flicker of firelight until his eyes stung from the strain, until the sounds below blurred into a dull rhythm of voices and laughter. When the moon finally rose, pale and hollow behind a curtain of clouds, he made his decision. Tomorrow would be too late. Whatever had driven the Mustang to his land had brought him here for a reason. Somewhere between duty and vengeance lay the same thing, a reckoning. Jonathan reached down and rested his hand on Rex's head. The dog looked up, eyes reflecting the faint gleam of moonlight. "Not yet," Jonathan whispered, his breath visible in the cold. But soon, the wind shifted again, scattering the snow in restless swirls across the hillside. Below, the cabin glowed faintly through the storm, a single blemish of light in an otherwise pure white world. Jonathan leaned back against the tree, rifle resting across his knees, and closed his eyes just long enough to steady the pulse of blood in his ears. He had waited through darker nights than this. He would wait again. And when those men stepped out into the cold, when the first sign of dawn brushed the valley, he would be ready. The night stretched long and merciless. The sky was a sheet of iron, thick with clouds that pressed low over the mountains, and the wind carried a sound, like distant breathing through the trees. Jonathan Reed sat with his back to a pine, the cold biting through his coat, his rifle laid across his knees. The snow had stopped falling hours ago, but it lay deep and heavy around him, a muffled landscape where every motion seemed amplified, every breath visible. Beside him, Rex dozed lightly, his chest rising and falling in slow rhythm, ears twitching at every groan of the forest. Jonathan's muscles ached from stillness, yet his mind was sharp. He had spent a lifetime learning to wait, and he knew the hour was close. The cabin below glowed dimly, a small pocket of yellow light in the valley's white hush. The men inside had grown quiet. Their laughter had faded, replaced by the low murmur of voices and the occasional clink of metal. Somewhere, a door creaked, then nothing. Only the sound of the wind remained. Jonathan rose carefully, brushing the frost from his coat. The night was his ally now. The clouds had swallowed the moon, leaving only the faintest reflection of light across the snow. He gestured to Rex, who stood at once, alert but silent. They moved together through the trees, a dark pair gliding through the powder like ghosts. The smell of smoke and wet wood thickened as they descended. Jonathan stopped often, listening for the cadence of movement voices, the scrape of boots, the whinny of a horse. He heard none of it. The world felt suspended, the stillness before a shot. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Jonathan crouched behind a fallen log. The cabin stood only a few yards away, its windows fogged, the lantern light inside flickering weakly. He could see shadows through the cracks in the boards. 3 figures, one by the stove, one slumped at the table, the third near the back wall. They had grown careless. Men who think they are alone always do. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. He noted the positions of their rifles, the angle of the door, the snowdrift piled against the rear wall that could serve as cover. He breathed slow and even, every detail catalogued, every move planned before it began. He picked up a small piece of scrap metal from the ground, the rust biting cold through his glove, and tossed it toward the stable. It struck a tin bucket with a sharp ring that shattered the silence. Instantly, voices rose from inside the cabin. A chair scraped. A man swore. One of them burst out the front door, a lantern swinging in his hand, light spilling across the snow. Jonathan held his breath. The man stepped forward, squinting into the darkness, his rifle half raised. Then the horses in the stable reacted. The sound had startled them too. They snorted, stamped, and one reared against its rope. The noise grew wild and confused, echoing across the valley. The door slammed open again. The leader, the broad man with the beard, stepped out, shouting curses, his breath a storm of vapor. Behind him came the marksman, his rifle at the ready, scanning the tree line. "Calm 'em down," the leader barked, "before they break the damn ropes." The boy hovered uncertainly in the doorway, holding a second lantern, his face pale in the flickering light. Jonathan's pulse steadied. He raised his rifle and fired once. Not to kill, not yet, but into the air. The report cracked like thunder through the cold, and the horses screamed. In panic, they ripped free, plunging into the trees. Snow exploded under their hooves as they vanished into the night. Shouts followed, frantic and disordered. The boy dropped his lantern, and it went out with a hiss. Jonathan moved quickly, shifting position, circling left through the trees. Rex followed close, his breath quick, his paws silent. Below, chaos reigned. The bearded man bellowed orders. The second fired wildly into the dark, the flashes from his muzzle illuminating the trees in brief, violent bursts. Jonathan fired again, this time shattering the lantern in the leader's hand. Darkness swallowed them. In that moment of confusion, Rex sprang forward. The dog hit the marksman square in the chest, knocking him backward into the snow. The man shouted, the rifle slipping from his grip as teeth sank into his sleeve. The leader spun toward the noise, raising his pistol, but Jonathan was already there. He charged from the left, closing the distance in long, sure strides. The first shot went wide. The second grazed his coat. Jonathan tackled him hard, the 2 men crashing into the snow, the pistol flying from the man's hand. They rolled, breath steaming, fists striking. Jonathan's world narrowed to instinct. The weight of the man's arm, the smell of sweat and gunpowder, the burning in his lungs. He slammed the butt of his rifle against the side of the bearded man's head. The man went limp, collapsing into the snow. A cry cut through the night. The boy stood frozen near the door, his eyes wide, the rifle trembling in his hands. "Don't," Jonathan said quietly, stepping into the faint light that spilled from the cabin. The boy's breath came in quick bursts. His hand shook harder. For a moment, Jonathan saw not an enemy, but a child, one dragged into a world of men and blood. "Put it down," he said again, voice low and steady. "It's over." The rifle clattered to the ground. The boy fell to his knees, his shoulders shaking. Rex limped toward him, the sleeve of the marksman's coat torn to ribbons, fur matted with snow and blood. Jonathan turned in time to see the second man crawling away, one hand clutching his shoulder. He raised the rifle, fired once more, and the man went still. Then silence fell again, heavy and absolute. Jonathan stood there for a long time, breathing hard, the wind tugging at his coat. His heart hammered against his ribs, but beneath the adrenaline, there was only the cold clarity of necessity. He looked at Rex. The dog stood unsteadily, one side of his body dark with blood. "Easy, boy," Jonathan murmured, dropping to one knee. He pressed his gloved hand to the wound. It was shallow, a graze along the ribs, but it would need tending. "You're all right. You've been through worse." Rex's tail thumped weakly against the snow. He moved through the aftermath with grim efficiency. He gathered the weapons, kicked the pistol away from the unconscious leader, and bound his wrists with a length of rope from the stable. The boy watched, silent, tears freezing on his cheeks. The wounded marksman groaned once and fell still. Jonathan took no chances. He checked for a pulse and found it faint but steady. "You'll live," he muttered, though whether that was a mercy or not he couldn't say. When he entered the cabin, the warmth struck him like a blow. The air was thick with smoke and the sour stench of spilled whiskey. He tore a strip from a blanket and bandaged Rex's side, murmuring quietly all the while, his voice steady even as his hands trembled from exhaustion. On the table lay the spoils of their cruelty knives, coils of rope, and bundles of hide marked with stains too dark to be mistaken for anything but blood. He felt his stomach twist. These were not desperate men trying to survive the winter. They were profiteers, killers who found sport in suffering. He took what evidence he could: the hides, the marked bags, the rifles. By the time he finished, the first light of dawn had begun to creep through the cracks in the wall, painting thin bars of gray across the floor. The leader stirred, groaning, and Jonathan hauled him upright. "You'll answer for what you've done," he said. The man spat blood into the snow. "Ain't no law out here," he rasped. Jonathan met his eyes, cold and steady. "There is now." It took hours to prepare for the journey back to town. He loaded the surviving horses with what they would carry: evidence, supplies, and the weight of 3 bound prisoners. The boy said little, his face hollow, his eyes refusing to meet Jonathan's. When the time came to move, he tied their ropes to the saddles and set out toward the east. The wind had died, leaving a brittle calm in its place. Rex trotted beside him, limping but determined, every breath a small cloud of steam. The road was long and punishing. Snow fell again by midday, soft and steady, blurring the horizon until sky and earth became one. Jonathan walked ahead, breaking a path through the drifts. The prisoners stumbled behind him, muttering curses or shivering in silence. Hours passed in the same rhythm step, breath, silence, step again. The town lay more than 10 miles away, but Jonathan kept a soldier's pace, driven by something deeper than duty. By the time the first buildings appeared, the light was fading. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the faint sound of voices carried through the cold air. People turned as they saw him approach, a solitary figure leading horses burdened with bound men and bloodied hides. Doors opened. A few stepped forward cautiously, recognition dawning as they realized who he was. "Reed," someone whispered. "He's back." The sheriff met him in the middle of the street, his breath clouding the air. "What in God's name?" he began, but Jonathan cut him off. "Horse killers," he said simply. He gestured to the prisoners. "They were running a slaughter out in the hills. This one's the leader." He handed over the rope. The sheriff looked from the men to Jonathan, then to the dog at his side, and finally to the pile of blood-stained evidence strapped to the saddles. He nodded slowly. "You did right," he said quietly. Jonathan said nothing. The warmth of the saloon's lantern spilled onto the street, but he didn't go in. He waited until the prisoners were taken inside, the door closing behind them with a dull thud. Then he turned and began the long walk home. The journey back to the ranch was silent. Snow had covered their earlier tracks, erasing all trace of what had happened. The sky had cleared, and stars shone coldly above the plains. Rex limped beside him, each step steady, his head held low, but his spirit unbroken. When they reached the small house, Jonathan opened the door and let the warmth from the fire spill out across the threshold. He knelt by the hearth, unbuttoned his coat, and fed the flames until the room glowed with a soft orange light. Rex lay beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the windows. Jonathan glanced toward them and froze. At the edge of the field, bathed in the pale shimmer of moonlight, stood the black Mustang, its mane rippled in the wind, its breath visible in the cold air. For a moment, it simply watched, head held high, unafraid. Jonathan stood, stepping out onto the porch. The snow creaked under his boots. The horse's eyes met his, calm now, no longer wild with fear. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked toward the hills, disappearing into the white distance. Jonathan stood there until the last trace of it was gone. When he returned inside, he felt a strange peace settle over him, heavier than exhaustion, yet lighter than grief. He sat beside the fire, hand resting on Rex's back, and whispered, "He's free now. So are we." The dog sighed, a low sound of contentment, and closed his eyes. The flames crackled softly, painting the walls with gold and shadow. Outside, the snow fell again, gentle this time, covering the land in a blanket so pure it seemed to erase every scar. The war, the guilt, the long years of silence, all of it was being buried beneath that endless white. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the fire on his face, and let the sound of the wind fade into something that almost felt like peace. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe, share it with your friends, and check out the other videos on the channel. See you in the next one.